Hello, thank you so much for joining my presentation today. My name is Dr. Marquetta Strait, and I will be presenting on a portion of my dissertation entitled Assessing Peer Instructors' Intercultural Competence and Potential Influences in Higher Education. I want to go ahead and kick things off by talking about what is happening in the research. So with the literature, there's been a higher emphasis on diversity and inclusion initiatives because of social injustices, and also even thinking about learning aspects, students experiencing a decreased sense of belonging. So more research is beckoning critical development of faculty and even for peer instructors when it comes to developing more inclusive learning spaces. And so when we're thinking about our peer instructors, I really want us to consider our undergraduate teaching assistants, but also facilitators of peer learning experiences. However, what we can't exempt from this process is the human nature of peer instructors. So peer instructors has been very beneficial for college student retention and being able to create a relatability between student to student, especially when you're thinking about historically challenging courses. However, because we're humans, we can still fall as a suspect or even fall prey to prejudice and exclusion. And so larger portions of this study for my dissertation focuses on the emphasis or the connection between the intercultural competence and culturally responsive teaching practices. But for the purposes of the study, we'll just focus on the first two questions, focusing on peer instructors. To what degree are SI leaders interculturally competent, and what experiences have influenced SI leaders' intercultural competence? So SI leaders in this particular context are undergraduate peer instructors, which we will learn about more a little bit later. And so when we're thinking about culture, it's really critical that we focus on culture not being monolithic. It's something that is ever changing. And I really love Mieto's definition of culture, talking about the ever changing values, traditions, social and political relations, and worldview created, but also how those types of connections can bring people together because they may share a common history or language or religion or social class. And so those different elements, and as well as those different influences. Now, if intercultural competence is new to you, just think more so that intercultural competence involves certain knowledge, skills, and attitudes that are necessary to be demonstrated and also perceived or reflected upon to be able to be interculturally competent. And so guiding this particular study is my theoretical framework, the intercultural developmental continuum. So with the IDC, this was supported by the developmental model of intercultural sensitivity, which was created by Bennett. But this entire continuum focuses on, hey, we have a starting place, and this is where we're trying to go. And so for the monocultural mindset, I want you to kind of think of a monocultural mindset as tunnel vision. Okay, so I love when I'm traveling, I love going through tunnels, but that means that you can't really see other aspects, or you can't really see outside of the tunnel in this particular process. And so if we're approaching these different developmental orientations along this continuum, we have denial, which focuses on overlooking difference, polarization, which focuses on criticizing difference. Minimization represents that transitional period. So now I'm more so going into an intercultural mindset, but I may focus more so on similarities versus looking at difference as really critical and important to the context. And then also acceptance, which deeply understands difference, but there's some opportunities for me to also develop in my own personal culture, as well as adaptation, which allows me to be able to shift and to go into different cultural contexts or engage with different diverse others in a more appropriate and effective way. Now, the farther we go we go more into an intercultural mindset. So just as I mentioned, monocultural mindset being more so like tunnel vision, think of an intercultural mindset as a highway. So it has many different lanes, many different experiences, but we're all kind of going in the same direction. So the research context included here focuses on a Midwestern Research One University, a predominantly white institution serving about 4,500 students at this particular center that's involved. And so this center has this program called the Supplemental Instruction Program, which focuses on peer instruction or peer learning, and it focuses on a STEM-based program. And so it has many STEM-based courses. So if this is new to you, I want you to imagine that I just took a chemistry class. I did really well in this chemistry class. And it didn't mean that I just knew chemistry. I just worked really hard to try my best in the class. And so I probably made an A or a B in this class. And I was like, man, that was a very difficult class. And I really want to be able to help other people. Well, I get connected with the SI program and I get hired, as well as I get trained on instructional strategies that I can utilize. And now I'm working with the program. That next semester, I'm sitting in on those classes again for chemistry to relearn the course material. And then I'm facilitating interactive study sessions. So a part of this role is not me actually being a teacher or a teaching assistant. However, I'm doing instructional planning to make sure that things are going smoothly in my sessions. I have to come with some type of preparation, even though I'm the facilitator of the session. So at the start of this particular study, the study had some external influences that were happening. First off, COVID-19, the pandemic, really did impact this particular process and this timing. And so in this particular time, this was the first semester that leaders were conducting their sessions in an online platform. And so the first year per se. So they had already completed one semester of doing it online, and now my study is coming. So this would be technically the second semester that they were doing this. Another important thing that was happening was racial and social injustice, as well as political challenges that were happening, because you remember the insurrection, and then also the impact that that had on enrollment for higher education institutions. Specific to this context is that they do have a DEI related session in their student leader training. However, there currently isn't an opportunity to track those measures across the board. And so this is why this particular research was so interesting to be able to do. And especially because I particularly am really interested, my research areas are in academic success and instructional design. So on this slide, you can see the different phases that I include in my study. So in phase one of this study, and this is pretty much for my entire dissertation, in phase one of my study, my quantitative data was the collection of the IDI results for my 54 SI leaders, and I focused on descriptive statistics for this particular portion of the study. And so that informed me of my participants, of my leaders, and then I sent out emails recruiting. And the eligibility basically was that the leaders had to have had led for at least one full semester of sessions and currently leading sessions in that particular study. And then phase two was doing the mixed method case study data. And as you can see, I've grayed out some of the text, and that's because this information is, again, a part of my larger study for my dissertation, just to let you know what was included, so that information is available. But for the purposes of this white paper presentation, the information that's not grayed is what we're focusing on. Sample questions that I included in my interviews, because I did 1 hour interviews, was located on the screen before, more so about their lived experiences. So for my participants, I have 54 leaders, 22 males, 30 females, and 2 that mention other. And as you can see from my leader demographics, there's a larger percentage of white peer instructors in this program, followed by 20% that are international, Asian, and 3 as Hispanic or Latino. So now you get to meet my qualitative participants. Because this is a mixed method study, I have 54 leaders for my quantitative portion. As I mentioned, these were the particular participants that opted to be in that qualitative component. So for today's purpose, I'm focusing on these 4 participants. First being Aaron, who identifies as a white man, junior in aerospace and engineering. Aisha, who identifies as an Asian Indian woman, junior in neurobiology and physiology. Haley, who identifies as a Latina woman, junior in neurobiology and physiology. And lastly, Amira, who identifies as a white woman, junior microbiology. So these are my qualitative participants, and these are the individuals that are pretty much informing us of that next part of the study. So the measure that was included, as I mentioned before, was the IDI, and this focused on the intercultural developmental continuum framework of those 5 developmental orientations that we spoke about earlier. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the IDI, individuals taking the IDI will receive 3 output scores, and 1 being their perceived orientation. So kind of think of it as this is where individuals desire to be. Like, one thing I really love about the IDI is that it allows people, it gives you a score based off of what you think you are, based off of where your scores are. Secondly, it gives you the developmental orientation. So it shows you, like, back to reality, this is where you actually are. And then your orientation gap is the difference between the 2 orientations. So for my results for the quantitative data, answering my first research question, to what degree are SI leaders interculturally competent? So as you can see from the graph, we can see that majority of the leaders perceive to be in acceptance, which means being able to deeply understand difference. However, from the results, they mostly fell in minimization, which means they tend to overemphasize cultural similarities. So as you can see from this descriptors chart, this conveys more about the data and how the leaders had a measured perceived orientation of a mean of 120.65 and a DO as well of 90.36, and an orientation gap of 30.30. So in essence, the leaders overestimated their intercultural competence, which is shown in the orientation gap of 30.25. And so why this may be problematic is that leaders may feel equipped to handle multicultural groups in their learning sessions because they've had some slight knowledge in the past, but this is showing that they indeed have blind spots that actually need to be addressed. So I definitely want to take us through 1 or 2 of my participants so that you can have a better understanding of their experiences. So this research question 2 focuses on what experiences have influenced SI leaders' intercultural competence. So what's interesting here is that you can see Aaron's perceived orientation was acceptance, and his developmental orientation is polarization. As you can see, his salient sociocultural identities, so this was a part of the interview process where they selected 3 salient sociocultural identities. And then also from here is where I coded the information of things that seemed like pivotal moments in their lives where they had influences. So here's the quote from Aaron. I feel like these race and nationality nationality all can be tied together in some ways, but they're also different too. Like, let's say someone who's Quebecois and white might have a different experience than someone who's Quebecois and Black or Quebecois and Native American. It's really important to value and consider, especially when it comes to learning or understanding the experiences of others, because that can also play a significant role on their life and their views, beliefs, and where they're coming from. What's really exciting from doing this research is that Erin was one of those people that would always tell you things and you'd be like, that's interesting. But at the same time, there were times where I felt like Erin was just kind of telling me what I wanted to hear. His answers were always really interesting and well crafted. However, what's concerning here, because you look at this and you're like, man, that's really good. But what's concerning here is that Erin was actually responding to, why is race and nationality important to you, to your culture? And so every time Erin spoke about these issues or responded, he always seemed to pretty much shift to talking about other cultures. And so that really does actually well align with Erin's developmental orientation here, because Erin is in polarization. Well, polarization means that one can have an us versus them type of stance where they have a critical view. And in this case, because he's reversal, Erin is actually idolizing other cultures. And so this makes sense why this would actually happen. And even if we look at some of Erin's influencers, we could see that he's involved in a global engineering certificate program. And that's something that he didn't have to be a part of, but he wanted to be a part of that process. And he wanted to go to the study abroad opportunities involved here. So we definitely see that Erin has had experiences where he can actually see how those different narratives between the Quebecois and Black or Quebecois and Native American could play out. However, I would challenge and support Erin to actually have more experiences where he's focusing on his own culture as well, so that he can freely be able to talk about that when asked, or even being able to share on his own accord. A second participant that is also really interesting is Aisha. So Aisha is a chemistry leader. Her perceived orientation is acceptance. Her developmental orientation is minimization. As you can see, these are her different salient social cultural identities. And what's really fascinating about Aisha's experience is that she identifies as a brown, Asian, Indian, first generation queer woman. Like, that's how she identifies. And so it's really great to be able to hear her story and hear about her experiences. And as you can see, that these were pivotal influencers in her life when it comes to her family background, her being a first generation Asian Indian, but also her education experiences as well. She did face some microaggressions being in her school and not having a lot of other Asian Indians at her school really did play a role in how she understood her culture and fought for her culture in ways. So here's an example of a quote that Aisha mentioned, where she's describing a leadership position different from SI, but similar in some ways. She says, oh my gosh, he is getting more people to come to him. And we're both equally educated, and we both equally have the same amount of experience with being a TI. And it was kind of frustrating seeing that. And I don't know, I guess people see my name, they're like, oh, she's going to be an international student from India. I guess with a lot of students, they would think, okay, if I go to her session, she's going to have an accent. I'm not even going to understand her. They see me and they have these assumptions. So what Aisha is expressing is that she's speaking on her experiences of feeling as in a way that she has to compete with her colleague who's a white male. And she's even talking about that, right? She's even talking about how, hey, we have similar experiences. We have the similar time frame here. Why are you all not coming? And so in some ways, she's also questioning herself and questioning her experiences and questioning the students that are going. And so in a lot of ways, this is presenting stereotype threat in the way that she's beginning to question her abilities, her professionalism, but also considering the assumptions that people who have probably had those assumptions of her in the past, she's also seeing that here too. And just imagining that, hey, this person or these students may not want to come to my session just because I have an accent. And so these are the types of experiences that our leaders are going through. And what's critical about these particular questions, these research questions, is like, I really wanted to know and understand these leaders and their own authenticity, because if they're not able to really see that for themselves, how can we actually expect for them to do it for others? And so it was really great to be able to do that for this particular study. So again, those were the first two questions of my study. My study definitely does go into more detail. You can definitely check out my dissertation if you have more questions about it. But just to discuss some of these points, the first critical point that's important for us to understand is that there is an intercultural competence orientation gap that is happening for this group of students. They overestimated their intercultural competence. So it was shown that the leaders overemphasized that their intercultural competence. And research does show that this is common. So it's pretty common, especially for our undergraduate students, because we often perceive ourselves as more competent in the areas than we actually are. And Hammer, the developer of the intercultural developmental continuum, also talks about the Dunning-Kruger effect of being able to have some slight knowledge. Maybe we've had some slight experiences that may have told us or maybe try to inform us that we are competent in an area, but we need more development. And so even when it comes to this particular context, it could be the slight knowledge, could be that these leaders have completed certain courses and they feel as though they're competent already. They've had certain experiences, such as engaging in multicultural teams. And so they feel as though, hey, I'm already competent. And even thinking about Aisha and the bicultural experiences Aisha had, you know, you can already think that you're really competent. However, it can show that there's still a gap that is present. So the orientation gap could allude to potential facilitation strengths and weaknesses of leaders. And the perceived orientation also shows that the leaders want to be reflected as one who is accepting, but there's still a gap present. So even though the majority of them fell in the developmental orientation of acceptance for their perceived orientation, there's still a gap. My critical point 2 focuses on the lived experiences and instructional programming. So making the study mixed methods in pursuit of these goals actually amplified the experiences. So we saw joy from these experiences. We also saw some trauma that actually happened too. And so understanding that without both strands, and this is something Deardorff really stresses, is that if you're going to assess intercultural competence, you need to look at both quant and qual, and just great practice as well as looking at quant and qual is really beneficial. The connections of their lived experiences and the impact of their learning experience is evident in their perspective of their role as the peer instructors. And a concerning point is that some leaders have not been challenged, as we mentioned about Erin earlier, have not been challenged as much to consider their experiences in more depth. So cultural conversations could become one-sided or shallow in that regard. So some limitations and future opportunities, just based off of those two, and even encompassing the entire dissertation project, and some of the limitations that this does not really express the international leaders' perspectives or limited perspectives from Black and Brown participants. And so just having more opportunities to engage with these participants would be really beneficial for future work and future studies. For future research, definitely engaging again with international leader perspectives to really see their experiences and the experiences that they've had. I've heard of a lot of international students adapting to the academic setting of being in the United States. However, how does that play a role in their intercultural competence, and how does that play a role in their professional responsibilities? And then even looking at how we're actually including these into their actual professional responsibilities. How are we tracking this? How are we measuring this in a way that is sustainable? And definitely being able to lead in sustainable ways. When I think of peer instructor programs, these are types of programs with high turnover. And so how do we make sure that that's sustainable? What about our leaders that stick around for a long period of time? And so being able to keep them still engaged and keep them interested in growing in their intercultural competence. So I just want to thank you all for joining my presentation for today. Like I said, this is just a fragment of my dissertation, but I'm really excited to have been able to share. I really want to thank Silmar for providing me with this opportunity and blessing me with the seed grant so that I could be able to see all of this research planning come to fruition. So feel free, if you have any questions for me, you can feel free to email me. You can also check out my dissertation, but I really want to thank you all for joining my presentation today. Thank you and have a wonderful day.